In the shadows of human history, whispered rituals have shaped civilizations and shattered minds in ways most people will never understand. Tonight, we're diving into practices so dark, so fundamentally disturbing, that entire governments have classified the evidence and buried the testimonies of survivors who lived to tell their stories. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It isn't urban legend. These are documented accounts of ritual practices that have operated in plain sight, hidden behind closed doors, protected by silence and fear. And the deeper we dig, the more we realize that some of humanity's most respected institutions have harbored secrets that would make your blood run cold. Over the past 18 months, I've interviewed former cult members, analyzed declassified documents, and traced connections that span continents and centuries. What I found wasn't just a collection of isolated incidents, it was a pattern, a methodology, a system designed to break human consciousness and rebuild it from the ground up. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why certain practices have been systematically erased from historical records, why witnesses have disappeared, and why the few who've spoken out have been discredited so thoroughly that their own families stopped believing them. But first, let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah contacted me through encrypted channels after watching one of my previous videos. She'd been searching for someone, anyone, who would listen to her story without immediately dismissing it as fantasy or mental illness. What she told me during our 3-hour conversation changed everything I thought I knew about organized manipulation of human consciousness. She grew up in what appeared to be a progressive spiritual community in Northern California. Meditation retreats, organic farming, communal living. On the surface, it looked like paradise. Families from across the country would visit, hoping to join this enlightened way of life. What they didn't know was that beneath the welcoming exterior, a carefully orchestrated system was selecting certain individuals for what the leadership called advanced spiritual preparation. Sarah was 11 when she was chosen. The rituals began gradually. Extended meditation sessions that lasted days. Sensory deprivation exercises disguised as spiritual purification. Sleep schedules deliberately disrupted to induce altered states of consciousness. Each step was introduced as a privilege, a sign that she was spiritually mature enough to handle deeper teachings. But the real horror began when they introduced her to the mirror room. Picture a space completely lined with mirrors. Floor to ceiling, every surface reflecting back infinite versions of yourself. Now imagine being placed in that room for hours while voices whisper your deepest fears, your most shameful thoughts, your most secret desires. The mirrors create a disorienting effect where you lose track of which reflection is real, which thoughts are yours, and which have been planted by the voices surrounding you. This wasn't random cruelty. This was precise psychological engineering designed to fracture identity and create multiple compartmentalized personalities that could be triggered and controlled through specific phrases, sounds, or symbols. Sarah described how her sense of self began to splinter. She would have conversations with herself in the mirror, but the reflections would respond differently than she expected. Sometimes, she couldn't remember entering the room. Other times, she would find herself speaking in voices that weren't her own, reciting words she didn't understand in languages she'd never learned. The community called this spiritual multiplicity. They taught that achieving this state meant transcending the limitations of singular consciousness. But what they were actually creating was a systematic dissociation that made their subjects incredibly susceptible to programming and control. And Sarah's community wasn't unique. Through my research, I've identified at least 47 similar operations that use variations of these techniques across 6 different countries over the past 5 decades. The methods vary, but the core principles remain consistent. Isolate the subject, disrupt normal consciousness, fragment identity, and rebuild according to the group's specifications. Some used religious frameworks, others positioned themselves as therapeutic communities or educational institutions. The most sophisticated operations embedded themselves within legitimate organizations, using their cover to access vulnerable populations and conduct their experiments under the protection of religious freedom or medical research exemptions. What makes these practices particularly sinister is how they exploit our deepest human needs, the need for belonging, for meaning, for transcendence. They offer answers to life's biggest questions, but the price is your fundamental ability to think independently. Take the technique known as reality anchoring, documented in at least 12 different cult operations. Subjects are exposed to carefully choreographed experiences that seem to prove the group's supernatural claims. Staged healings, manufactured prophecies, coordinated synchronicities that appear miraculous but are actually elaborate psychological theater designed to bypass critical thinking. One former member described watching what appeared to be a spontaneous healing during a group ceremony. A woman with a visible tumor on her neck was surrounded by the community. Prayers were offered, and the tumor visibly shrank before everyone's eyes. The experience was so powerful that it cemented his belief in the group's divine connection for over a decade. Only years later did he discover that the woman was a trained actress using a combination of makeup techniques and prosthetics. The miraculous healing was performed dozens of times for different audiences, each group believing they were witnessing a unique divine intervention. But the manufactured miracles were just the beginning. The real control came through what insiders call trauma bonding rituals. These ceremonies deliberately induce extreme psychological stress while positioning the group as the only source of comfort and safety. Participants might be subjected to hours of verbal abuse, forced to confess their deepest shames publicly, or made to witness disturbing imagery while being told that their emotional reactions prove their spiritual inadequacy. Then, just when the subject reaches their breaking point, the group provides relief, comfort, acceptance. Love bombing that feels incredibly powerful precisely because it comes after such intense suffering. The emotional whiplash creates a dependency that's incredibly difficult to break, even when the rational mind recognizes the manipulation. Dr. Margaret Chen, who spent 15 years studying cult recruitment and retention methods, explained it to me this way. These groups don't just want your obedience. They want to become your emotional and psychological life support system. Once they achieve that, leaving feels like suicide. The sophistication of these psychological operations is staggering. Many employ trained psychologists, former intelligence operatives, and specialists in behavioral modification. They study their subjects like laboratory animals, documenting which techniques produce the desired responses most efficiently. Internal documents I've obtained from one disbanded group reveal detailed psychological profiles of members, including their childhood traumas, relationship patterns, financial vulnerabilities, and what they called compliance triggers. These files read like intelligence dossiers, complete with strategies for exploiting each individual's specific psychological weaknesses. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these operations is how they've evolved and adapted over time. The crude techniques of early cult movements have been refined into precise instruments of psychological control that leave no physical evidence and can be practiced with minimal risk of legal consequences. Modern practitioners have learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. They avoid the obvious red flags that might alert authorities or concern family members. No more mass suicides or compound raids. Instead, they operate through networks of seemingly independent organizations, legitimate businesses, and respected institutions. The ritual abuse is carefully calibrated to stay just below the threshold of a criminal prosecution while maximizing psychological impact. Subjects are gradually conditioned to accept increasingly invasive procedures through a process that feels like spiritual advancement rather than systematic violation. And here is what keeps me awake at night. These techniques work. Not on everyone, but on enough people to make them incredibly dangerous. The human mind, it turns out, is far more malleable than most of us want to believe. Under the right conditions, with the right pressure applied consistently over time, almost anyone can be broken down and rebuilt according to someone else's specifications. The evidence suggests that we're not dealing with a few isolated cases of religious extremism. We're looking at a sophisticated understanding of human psychology being weaponized against vulnerable populations on a scale that most people can't imagine. And this is just the beginning. What I'm about to show you next will challenge everything you think you know about the boundaries between legitimate spiritual practice and systematic psychological abuse. Because the line between transformation and destruction is thinner than you might think. And the people crossing it have gotten very good at making their victims thank them for the experience. The methodology behind these psychological operations becomes even more chilling when you understand how they recruit new members. It's not random. These groups have developed what they call vulnerability mapping, sophisticated systems for identifying and targeting people who are most susceptible to their techniques. They focus on major life transitions: divorce, job loss, death of a loved one, graduation, moving to a new city, any major disruption that leaves someone feeling unmoored and searching for stability. They monitor college campuses, support groups, online forums, even social media posts that indicate emotional distress or spiritual seeking. I spoke with Marcus, a former recruiter for one of these organizations, who agreed to share his story on condition of anonymity. For 8 years, he worked at what he called the Harvest Circuit, a systematic approach to finding and evaluating potential recruits. His job was to identify people in crisis, establish trust, and gradually introduce them to the group's philosophy. He carried detailed psychological assessment tools disguised as spiritual questionnaires. Within hours of meeting someone, he could determine their childhood attachment patterns, their relationship with authority, their deepest insecurities, and most importantly, their threshold for accepting manipulation. Marcus described his training like military intelligence work. They studied body language, vocal patterns, micro-expressions. They learned to mirror speech patterns and adopt personas that would appeal to specific personality types. The most skilled recruiters could make almost anyone feel like they'd found their soulmate within a single conversation. But the real genius was in the gradual escalation. Nobody joins a cult expecting to be abused. The process is so incremental that victims don't realize how far they've traveled into darkness until escape seems impossible. It starts with seemingly innocent activities. Group dinners, hiking trips, book clubs, discussing philosophy or spirituality. The early stages are genuinely pleasant. Participants are love-bombed with attention, validation, and a sense of belonging they may never have experienced before. Then come the small compromises. Maybe you're asked to cut contact with one friend who doesn't understand your spiritual journey. Maybe you're encouraged to donate money you can't really afford as an act of faith. Maybe you participate in a group exercise that makes you slightly uncomfortable, but everyone else seems fine with it. Each compromise makes the next one easier to accept. Psychologists call this the foot in the door technique. But these groups have weaponized it into something far more sophisticated. They map out the exact sequence of escalating commitments that will lead someone from curious outsider to completely controlled insider. The rituals themselves serve multiple purposes beyond just psychological control. They create shared trauma that bonds participants together through what's known as traumatic bonding. When people suffer together, especially when that suffering is framed as meaningful or sacred, it creates powerful emotional connections that override rational judgment. I've documented ceremonies where participants are forced to eat repulsive substances while being told it represents their willingness to transcend physical limitations. Others involve prolonged physical stress positions disguised as meditation postures. Some include exposure to extreme temperatures, sensory bombardment, or controlled suffocation techniques that induce altered states of consciousness. The key is that these experiences are never presented as abuse. They're always framed as spiritual tests, initiations into higher wisdom, or necessary steps toward enlightenment. Participants often compete for the privilege of undergoing more intense rituals, believing that their willingness to suffer proves their spiritual commitment. One former member described a ceremony called ego dissolution, where participants were subjected to hours of psychological humiliation while being told that their emotional reactions were evidence of spiritual impurity. They were screamed at, forced to confess embarrassing secrets, and made to perform degrading acts while other members watched. But here's the crucial detail. At the end of the ceremony, they were overwhelmed with praise and affection. They were told they'd achieved a breakthrough, that they demonstrated incredible courage and spiritual maturity. The emotional whiplash from abuse to validation created such powerful relief that many described it as the most profound spiritual experience of their lives. This calculated manipulation of brain chemistry is no accident. These groups understand that extreme stress followed by relief creates neurochemical changes similar to those experienced during genuine spiritual or mystical experiences. They're essentially hijacking the brain's reward systems to create artificial enlightenment that keeps people coming back for more. The documentation I've uncovered reveals training materials that read like military psychological warfare manuals, detailed instructions on how to break down individual resistance, create dependency, and maintain control through carefully calibrated rewards and punishments. They've systematized the destruction of human agency with clinical precision. What's particularly disturbing is how these techniques have migrated beyond traditional cult settings. Elements of these psychological control methods are now being used in corporate training programs, therapeutic communities, and even some mainstream religious organizations. The line between influence and abuse has become increasingly blurred as these methods are repackaged and legitimized. I've traced connections between disbanded cult groups and consulting firms that now provide team building and leadership development services to Fortune 500 companies. Some of the same individuals who once ran abusive spiritual communities are now training executives in advanced persuasion techniques and consciousness transformation. The reach of these operations extends far beyond what most people imagine. Through shell companies, legitimate front organizations, and carefully placed infiltrators, these networks have embedded themselves throughout society. They operate schools, therapy centers, retreat facilities, and even medical research institutions. One investigation led me to a chain of private schools in 3 different states, all using curriculum developed by former members of a disbanded cult. The teaching methods included subtle psychological manipulation techniques designed to make children more compliant and less likely to question authority. Parents paying premium tuition thought they were giving their kids a progressive education, but they were actually funding an indoctrination program. The most sophisticated operations have learned to hide in plain sight. They've adopted the language of legitimate psychology, neuroscience, and spirituality to disguise their activities. They publish research papers, hold academic conferences, and maintain relationships with respected institutions. Their public face is often indistinguishable from legitimate organizations working in similar fields. But the survivors know the difference, and their stories reveal a level of systematic psychological abuse that challenges our fundamental assumptions about human nature, free will, and the boundaries of acceptable influence. The techniques I'm about to describe next represent the darkest evolution of these practices. Methods so sophisticated and so carefully designed that they can reshape human consciousness without the victim ever realizing what's happening to them. Because the ultimate goal isn't just control, it's the complete reconstruction of identity itself. These identity reconstruction protocols represent the culmination of decades of experimentation in human psychological manipulation. What makes them so terrifying isn't just their effectiveness, but how they've been perfected to leave no trace of their implementation. The process begins with what practitioners call baseline mapping, a comprehensive psychological assessment disguised as spiritual counseling or therapeutic intake. Over several sessions, trained operators create detailed profiles of their subjects' core beliefs, emotional triggers, relationship patterns, and most critically, their sense of personal identity. They're looking for what they call identity anchors, the fundamental beliefs about yourself that feel unshakable. Maybe you see yourself as a caring person, an intelligent person, someone with strong moral principles. These anchors become the primary targets for systematic dismantling. Dr. James Morrison, a former member who spent 12 years inside one of these operations before escaping, described the process to me in clinical detail. He held a doctorate in psychology and had been recruited specifically to help develop more sophisticated control techniques. What he witnessed still haunts him 15 years later. We created what we called cognitive funnels, he explained during our interview. Structured experiences designed to channel thought processes toward predetermined conclusions. The subject believes they're making independent realizations, but every step has been carefully choreographed. The technique works by presenting carefully crafted scenarios that appear to reveal uncomfortable truths about the subject's personality or behavior. Through role-playing exercises, group feedback sessions, and guided introspection, participants are led to discover negative patterns they never noticed before. Maybe they realize they've been selfish in relationships. Maybe they see how their intelligence has made them arrogant. Maybe they recognize patterns of moral compromise they'd previously justified. Each realization feels genuine because it contains enough truth to be believable. But the conclusions have been predetermined and orchestrated. Once these negative self-discoveries accumulate, the subject experiences what Morrison called identity collapse, a profound crisis where their previous self-concept no longer feels valid or sustainable. This creates a psychological vacuum that the group is perfectly positioned to fill. The reconstruction phase begins immediately. New identity components are introduced gradually, always framed as the subject's own insights or spiritual revelations. They discover they're actually someone who needs guidance, someone who works best in community, someone whose individual desires are less important than collective harmony. But the most insidious aspect is how these new identity elements are embedded with what Morrison termed compliance protocols, psychological triggers that activate automatic submission to group authority. These might be specific phrases, symbols, or even emotional states that instantly override critical thinking and activate programmed responses. One survivor described how a particular piece of music could instantly transport her back to a state of complete psychological dependence, even years after leaving the group. The neural pathways created during her reconstruction had been so thoroughly established that certain triggers could bypass her conscious mind entirely. The depth of this programming becomes clear when you examine the methods used to maintain it. Regular maintenance sessions reinforce the new identity structure while monitoring for signs of resistance or independent thought. These might be disguised as therapy, spiritual counseling, or personal development work. Subjects learn to monitor their own thoughts and report deviations from approved thinking patterns. They develop internal surveillance systems that make external monitoring unnecessary. The most successfully programmed individuals become their own psychological prison guards. What makes these techniques particularly dangerous is how they exploit our natural capacity for growth and change. Humans are designed to adapt, to incorporate new information, to evolve our understanding of ourselves and the world. These operations weaponize that flexibility against us. The neural mechanisms that allow genuine spiritual growth, psychological healing, and personal development are hijacked and redirected toward creating dependency and control. The same brain processes that could lead to authentic transformation are used to manufacture artificial personalities designed to serve the group's interest. I've documented cases where individuals emerge from these programs as completely different people, not in the positive sense of personal growth, but in the clinical sense of dissociative identity disorders. Their original personalities had been systematically suppressed and replaced with manufactured alternatives optimized for compliance. The technology behind these operations has evolved far beyond simple brainwashing or coercive persuasion. Modern practitioners employ neurofeedback equipment, biometric monitoring, and pharmaceutical interventions to enhance their psychological manipulation techniques. Some facilities use real-time brain imaging to monitor subjects during programming sessions, adjusting their techniques based on neurological responses. Others employ targeted sound frequencies, light patterns, or electromagnetic fields to induce specific brain states that make subjects more susceptible to suggestion. The combination of ancient psychological manipulation techniques with modern neuroscience has created something unprecedented in human history: the ability to systematically rewrite human consciousness with scientific precision. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation from my investigation is how these techniques have been studied, refined, and disseminated through legitimate academic and government channels. Declassified documents reveal decades of official research into mind control technologies, much of which was conducted on unwitting subjects through programs hidden within hospitals, universities, and research institutions. The techniques developed through these programs didn't disappear when the official projects ended. They migrated into private sector applications, alternative therapy movements, and the sophisticated cult operations we're examining today. The knowledge exists, the methods work, and they're being used right now on vulnerable populations around the world. The survivors I've interviewed represent just the tip of an iceberg that extends far deeper than most people can imagine. For every person who escapes and speaks out, there are dozens more who never realize what happened to them, who remain convinced that their psychological reconstruction was a positive spiritual experience. These operations have perfected the art of making victims grateful for their abuse, convinced that their loss of independent thought represents spiritual advancement. They create true believers who will defend their abusers and recruit new victims with genuine enthusiasm. The sophistication of these psychological weapons raises profound questions about the nature of human consciousness, free will, and personal identity. If our sense of self can be systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to someone else's specifications, what does that mean for our understanding of human autonomy? The evidence suggests we're far more vulnerable to psychological manipulation than our culture wants to acknowledge. The techniques I've documented don't work on everyone, but they work on enough people to represent a genuine threat to human freedom and dignity. And the most chilling part? The people developing and implementing these techniques often believe they're doing good work. They've convinced themselves that destroying individual identity serves a higher purpose, that their victims are better off without the burden of independent thought. This self-righteousness makes them incredibly dangerous because it removes the normal moral constraints that might limit their activities. They're not evil villains twirling mustaches. They're true believers, convinced they're saving souls and improving lives through the systematic destruction of human consciousness. The implications extend far beyond the immediate victims. As these techniques become more sophisticated and more widely available, they represent a fundamental threat to the psychological freedom that democratic societies depend upon. An informed citizenry capable of independent thought becomes impossible when consciousness itself can be manufactured and controlled. What I'm about to reveal next represents the most advanced evolution of these techniques, methods so subtle and so pervasive that they're already being implemented on a societal scale. Because the ultimate goal isn't just controlling individuals, it's reshaping human civilization itself, one carefully programmed mind at a time. The scale of these operations becomes truly staggering when you realize they're not just targeting individuals anymore. They've moved beyond recruiting vulnerable people one at a time. Now they're implementing mass influence campaigns designed to reshape entire populations through what they call cultural programming protocols. I discovered this through leaked documents from an organization calling itself the Institute for Social Harmony. On paper, they're a legitimate think tank studying community development and social cohesion. In reality, they're a sophisticated psychological warfare operation that's been testing mass manipulation techniques on entire communities for over 2 decades. Their approach is breathtakingly ambitious. Instead of breaking down individual minds, they're systematically altering the psychological environment of entire populations. They identify communities experiencing social stress, economic decline, political polarization, cultural change, and introduce carefully designed interventions that appear to address these problems while actually making people more susceptible to external control. The methodology is elegant in its simplicity. They don't try to convince people to believe specific ideas. Instead, they alter the psychological conditions under which people form beliefs. They manipulate the information environment, social dynamics, and emotional climate to channel collective thinking toward predetermined outcomes. Take their pilot program in a small Midwestern town that was struggling with factory closures and population decline. The Institute arrived offering community revitalization services, town halls, leadership training, economic development planning. Everything appeared constructive and beneficial, but embedded within these seemingly helpful activities were sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques adapted from individual cult programming for mass deployment. Community meetings were structured to create collective emotional experiences that bonded participants while making them more susceptible to groupthink. They introduced what they called consensus-building exercises that were actually designed to identify and neutralize independent thinkers. Anyone who consistently raised questions or expressed dissenting views was subtly marginalized through social pressure techniques that made their concerns appear unreasonable or divisive. Over 18 months, the community's decision-making processes were gradually centralized around institute-approved leaders who had been psychologically profiled and selected for their susceptibility to external influence. Local institutions, churches, schools, civic organizations were infiltrated with institute-trained facilitators who introduced programming techniques disguised as team building and community engagement activities. The results were remarkable. A previously diverse community with healthy debate and independent thinking transformed into what observers described as an eerie consensus, where dissent had become virtually impossible, not through overt suppression, but through psychological conditioning that made disagreement feel uncomfortable and antisocial. Most residents genuinely believed their community had become more harmonious and united. They couldn't identify any specific moment when their thinking had been altered. The changes felt organic, like natural social evolution, but detailed analysis of meeting transcripts, social media posts, and behavioral patterns revealed a systematic elimination of independent thought that had been engineered with clinical precision. This template has been replicated in dozens of communities across multiple countries. Each implementation is customized for local conditions, but the core methodology remains consistent. Create artificial social cohesion by systematically eliminating psychological diversity. The technique works because it exploits fundamental human needs for belonging and social acceptance. People naturally conform to group norms to maintain their position within the community. By carefully manipulating what appears normal and acceptable, these operations can reshape collective behavior without anyone realizing they're being controlled. But community-level programming was just the testing ground. The real target is much larger. Through shell companies and legitimate research partnerships, the Institute and similar organizations have embedded their techniques within educational systems, corporate training programs, political campaigns, and mass media operations. The same psychological manipulation methods are being deployed at unprecedented scale through channels that most people trust completely. Educational curricula now include social-emotional learning components that are actually sophisticated psychological conditioning programs. Students learn to identify and suppress problematic thought patterns while developing automatic compliance responses to authority figures. The techniques are so subtly integrated that teachers implementing them often don't understand their true purpose. Corporate training programs have evolved beyond simple skill development into comprehensive personality modification systems. Employees undergo leadership development and team optimization processes that systematically identify and eliminate traits associated with independent thinking and whistleblowing. I've traced these techniques into medical residency programs where future doctors are conditioned to accept institutional authority without question. Journalism schools where students learn to self-censor controversial investigations, and law enforcement training where officers are psychologically programmed to prioritize order over individual rights. The breadth of penetration is astounding. These psychological manipulation techniques have been woven into the fabric of modern society so thoroughly that they become invisible. People experience them as normal parts of education, professional development, and social participation. And what makes this particularly insidious is how the programming adapts to individual psychology. Through data mining, behavioral analysis, and predictive algorithms, these systems can customize their manipulation techniques for maximum effectiveness on specific personality types. The same underlying control mechanisms are deployed through different channels and framed in different ways, depending on the target population. For religious communities, the techniques are embedded in spiritual development programs. For secular populations, they're integrated into wellness and self-improvement movements. For intellectuals, they're disguised as advanced psychological or philosophical training. Everyone receives programming customized to their existing beliefs and values. The individuals implementing these programs often have no idea they're participating in mass psychological manipulation. They've been selected and trained through the same techniques they're deploying on others. They genuinely believe they're providing beneficial services while serving as unwitting agents in a much larger control system. This creates multiple layers of deniability and protection. When concerns are raised about specific programs or techniques, the response comes from true believers who can honestly defend their work because they don't understand its real purpose. They've been programmed to see criticism as misguided or malicious. The documentation I've uncovered suggests this systematic psychological conditioning has been operational for at least 3 decades, steadily expanding its reach and sophistication. Entire generations have now been exposed to these techniques from childhood through adulthood, creating populations with fundamentally altered psychological profiles. The effects are becoming visible in declining rates of independent thinking, reduced capacity for sustained attention, increased susceptibility to emotional manipulation, and weakened resistance to authority. These changes are often attributed to technology, social media, or cultural shifts, but the evidence points to systematic psychological engineering. Most disturbing is how these changes are self-reinforcing. As populations become more psychologically compliant, they become less capable of recognizing or resisting further manipulation. The conditioning creates a positive feedback loop that accelerates the loss of cognitive freedom with each generation. The ultimate goal appears to be creating what internal documents describe as cognitively optimized populations, human societies that maintain the appearance of freedom and democracy while being psychologically incapable of genuine independent thought or effective resistance to control. This represents something unprecedented in human history: the systematic engineering of consciousness at civilizational scale, not through overt totalitarianism or physical coercion, but through psychological conditioning so sophisticated that victims actively participate in their own mental enslavement. The techniques have evolved far beyond anything previously documented in academic literature or historical accounts of social control. They represent a quantum leap in humanity's capacity for psychological manipulation, made possible by advances in neuroscience, behavioral psychology, and information technology. And here's what keeps me awake at night knowing all this. If these operations have been successful enough to deploy at societal scale, how can we even trust our own thoughts about what we've just learned? How do we know reactions to this information aren't themselves the product of psychological programming designed to channel our responses in predetermined directions? The rabbit hole goes deeper than most minds can safely follow. But before we lose ourselves entirely in existential vertigo, there's one more layer to this nightmare that needs to be exposed. Because everything we've discussed so far assumes these operations are run by human beings with comprehensible motivations. But the evidence suggests something far stranger may be directing this systematic assault on human consciousness. After 18 months of investigation, interviewing survivors, analyzing documents, and tracing connections that span decades, I can no longer pretend these are isolated incidents or fringe extremism. We're looking at a coordinated assault on human consciousness that operates with the precision of military intelligence and the reach of multinational corporations. The techniques I've documented work. They're being used right now, and they're evolving faster than our ability to recognize or resist them. Every day, more people lose their capacity for independent thought while being convinced they're experiencing personal growth or spiritual awakening. But here's what gives me hope. The fact that you've watched this far means your mind isn't completely captured. You can still question, still think, still recognize manipulation when it's exposed to light. That makes you part of the solution. If this investigation has taught me anything, it's that awareness is the first line of defense. These operations depend on invisibility, on victims who never realize they're being programmed. The moment we start recognizing the techniques, questioning the narratives, and trusting our instincts when something feels wrong, their power begins to crack. Document everything, question everything. Trust your gut when social situations feel artificially constructed or when pressure to conform seems orchestrated. And remember that in a world where consciousness itself has become a battlefield, independent thought isn't just a luxury. It's an act of resistance. The shadows have been exposed. Now the question is, what are you going to do with what you know?